Next on MovieDrome, American Gothic in the Bible Belt. John Huston's Wise Blood.
Something on your mind?
Usual business.
Make yourself at home.
A thing that I mean to have you know is that I ain't no goddamn preacher.
That's okay, son. Mama don't mind if you ain't no preacher, as long as you got $4.
Plus...
Hey, look! One of them's gone already.
They swim. The mark of Satan is upon them.
Vincent Price, Witchfinder General.
Schwarze trifft, das wollten.
Barbarella joins the illustrious company of Modesty Blaise and Fritz the Cat in being a movie based on a comic strip. It's directed by Roger Vadim, a Frenchman, and it stars a young ingenue from America, his wife, Jane Fonda. Vadim is one of those directors who loves a woman. He made a film called And God Created Woman, starring Brigitte Bardot, and he liked it so much that last year he made it again, this time starring Rebecca De Mornay. He's not a really good director. He's sort of like Polanski, but without the pain and the brain. But Barbarella is not a bad film. It's entertaining, has good sets, very good costumes. Miss Fonda's costume designed by Paco Rabanne. It also has a lot of very good actors in it, including Milo O'Shea, David Hemmings in the role of Dildano, Marcel Marceau, and Anita Pallenberg, who you might recall was one of Mick Jagger's roommates in Performance. The author, well, there's 8 of them, but the first person listed in the writing credits is Terry Southern. He's an American who wrote Candy, The Magic Christian, and the screenplays for Lolita and Dr. Strangelove. Apparently Jane Fonda still likes Barbarella and stands by it. I wonder why. What does Kitty think?
Tonight on MovieDrome we present Escape from New York, co-written and directed by John Carpenter. Carpenter is the director of a series of horror and science fiction films, the most famous and successful of which is Halloween. His first film, and in some ways still his best, was a science fiction comedy called Dark Star, about surfers in space. Dark Star was written by one Dan O'Banion, who later wrote Alien. Alien, in spite of a much larger budget and the inimitable chocolate box photography of Ridley Scott, is essentially the same story as Dark Star. Mad alien aboard spaceship, picking off the crew, minus the very funny humor of Carpenter's original super low-budget film. Carpenter is a variable director, and in some ways Escape from New York is one of his more disappointing films. Sometimes he really pulls it off, as with Assault on Precinct 13 or his remake of The Thing. Once he made an almost brilliant film, the highly underrated They Live. They Live is one of the few recent American films to feature a homeless person as the hero. And for the first hour, it's a mesmeric revelation of how yuppies and the Soho video and advertising crowd are really aliens who, having taken over the planet, are busy throwing the rest of us out of work. They Live falls down at the end, stumbling, as do many modern science fiction films, into a dull welter of chases down corridors and high-tech gunfire. And even in this, it's not alone. Similar malaises affect Total Recall and Terminator 2. Escape from New York really should have been a brilliant film. Its premise is that 5 years from now, all order has broken down, and New York has been turned into a vast, maximum security prison, encircled by a giant wall. Budgeted in 1981 at $7 million, it was Carpenter's most expensive film to that date. It features some splendid actors, including Lee Van Cleef, Harry Dean Stanton, John Diehl, and Kurt Russell, doing a very funny Eastwood imitation. With a great premise, decent money, and a good cast, where does Escape from New York go wrong? Partially, I think it's because of the inadequate special effects, which were done at Roger Corman's cheapo studio in a Los Angeles lumber yard. If you study the credits closely, you'll see the name of one Jim Cameron, listed as effects photographer and matte artist. Could this be the renowned James Cameron of Terminator and The Abyss fame? Maybe it could, if you recall how bad the model work and the mattes were in Terminator 1. More to the point, though, is that the film obviously doesn't take place here in New York. For budgetary reasons, it was shot in St. Louis and Century City, Los Angeles, neither of which resemble Manhattan at all. And there's a certain laziness and sprawling quality to the script, which never really gets going beyond the level of in-jokes, such as subsidiary characters named Romero and Cronenberg. Nevertheless, here it is.
Wurlitzer is currently working on a story about the Buddha for Bertolucci. Walker is portrayed by Ed Harris, an outstanding American actor who specializes in half-charming, half-psychotic anti-heroes. Harris has also appeared in Under Fire, To Kill a Priest, The Abyss, and Alamo Bay. He also played the astronaut John Glenn in The Right Stuff. Tonight, Harris portrays William Walker, an adventurer from Nashville, Tennessee, who in the mid-1850s invaded and made himself president of Nicaragua. Walker was something of a Renaissance man, newspaper publisher, lawyer, Edinburgh University medical student, and was betrothed to the most beautiful woman in Nashville, who happened to be a deaf mute. He had extraordinary luck in battle and was reputed to be impervious to gunfire, although actually he was wounded several times. Walker was funded by the shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt, and for several years was reported to be the most popular man in the United States. There's not much more that I can say about this film since I am its director. I personally am very fond of it. There are those who are not. For an impartial assessment, why don't we turn, as always, to the BFI's monthly film bulletin. Ed Harris's performance is contained, fixated, and charismatic enough to make sense of Walker's constant switching along the spectrum from liberator to dictator. Cox's direction does a lot of switching of its own, along the spectrum from Peckinpah westerns to the apocalyptic scenarios of Jodorowsky and the visionary excesses of Herzog. Closer to home, Walker may have been intended as a political cut-up on Leicester lines, but unfortunately came out as Carry-On Contras. Yeah!
And here on 2 Now, Alex Cox introduces a classic cult movie from 1951 in tonight's MovieDrome.
Tonight's film is The Thing from Another World, directed in 1951 by Christian Nyby and remade recently as The Thing by John Carpenter. It's a story of strange events at the North Pole. In typical 1950s science fiction style, old professors, sexy secretaries, and the US military battle, well, a thing from another world. The film has a long, slow build-up with a lot of dialogue. The script is based on a short story by John Campbell, who was editor of Analog, the science fiction magazine.
The fact that the dialogue often overlaps has led various authorities to believe that the film was in fact directed by Howard Hawks, its nominal producer. Hawks was famous for his fast-talking, overlapping dialogue, and had apparently employed Nyby as an assistant director on previous films. In the original Thing, unlike the remake, the monster is rarely seen. Most of its mayhem takes place off-screen, like the battles in Shakespearean tragedy. Its name, like the name of the man with X-ray eyes, is X. Flying saucer enthusiasts should note that the story, which includes a crashed UFO and a giant plant which drinks blood, is not dissimilar to the notorious Roswell incident of 1946, in which a U.S. Air Force base issued a press release that a flying disc had crashed in southern New Mexico with the remains of 4 dead aliens on board. Watch the skies.
Here on 2 Now, it's time to drive into the MovieDrome. Tonight's production, Alphaville, is introduced by film director Alex Cox.
Alphaville is a science fiction film noir comedy made by Jean-Luc Godard in 1965. It's the story of Lemmy Caution, played by Eddie Constantine, a special investigator, galactic traveler, and reporter for Figaro Pravda, who travels to the city of Alphaville in search of the mysterious Professor Von Braun. All this might make it sound a bit like Blade Runner, but it's not. The whole film was shot in black and white in Paris without special effects. Godard was one of the first names of the French New Wave. He also directed Breathless and Weekend. And he creates a really strong science fiction movie out of hotel corridors and tight angles on flashing signs and household objects, like doorknobs and light bulbs. This is not to everyone's taste, of course. And if you're offended by those French movies like Hiroshima Mon Amour or Last Year at Marienbad, where disembodied voices talk about philosophy, you might not like this film. I will confess a predilection for such stuff, however, especially when it's funny, which Alphaville is. Cameraman Raoul Coutard does an amazing job with light and dark and scenes shot through glass, and the whole frightening profile of a modern fascist city. The script, by Godard, is extremely funny, and if you pay attention, really makes its own kind of sense. It's interesting to compare Alphaville with The Trial, Orson Welles' Kafka film, which is also part of this season. If I may, at risk of being corrected, point out what appears to be an error in the car department. Lemmy Caution claims he drives a Galaxie, but isn't the car he drives up in at the start a Mustang? Je suis très bien, merci, je vous en prie.
And this evening we're running a little late because of our coverage of the closing stages of the Open Golf Championship. So now on BBC Two, Alex Cox introduces tonight's MovieDrome Double Bill.
The Duelists was directed by Ridley Scott in 1977. It's the story of 2 French hussars who engage in a series of affairs of honor at the beginning of the 19th century. It was produced by David Putnam, the man the Reader's Digest called the father of British cinema. So naturally it stars 2 Americans, Keith Carradine and Harvey Keitel, in the principal roles. It's great to look at, as you might expect, for Scott, here directing his first feature film, was one of the so-called Renaissance directors, a group of British TV commercial chaps who moved to Hollywood in the late 70s to make feature films. Other members of this august clan include Adrian Lyne, Alan Parker, Hugh Hudson, and Ridley Scott's equally talented brother, Tony. It's a little unfair to poke fun at the Renaissance gang. They didn't ask to be called that, and compared to the generation of British directors who came after them, the ones who earned their stripes directing pop videos, their qualifications are almost impeccable. Plus, let's face it, audiences like films like Flashdance and Mississippi Burning, which look like Hovis commercials or Billy Joel promos. Audiences, by which I don't mean the mad coterie of cult movie enthusiasts, but the vast throngs who turn out for Rambo and Days of Thunder, like their films to be as much like watching TV as possible. Try sticking a reel of Stranger Than Paradise into the middle of Top Gun. The punters will notice. They won't approve. The general tendency of what we call a culture is homogeneity, and if that goes against original and personal filmmaking, so be it. The Duelist is based on a story by Joseph Conrad called The Duel. Conrad is an author who fascinates and bedevils film directors. Orson Welles came to Hollywood determined to make a film version of Conrad's Nostromo, but was frustrated by delays and ended up doing Citizen Kane instead. Francis Coppola based Apocalypse Now on Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The late lamented David Lean died during production of Nostromo earlier this year. Yet the least effective parts of Apocalypse are those that try to cram the Vietnam War into a Conradian worldview. The story of The Duelists works pretty well. The script was by Gerald Vaughan Hughes, the production design by Peter Hampton, and the sound recording by Hugh Strain are both very good. But in the end, it's an unengaging film, made according to a reliable formula. Get a couple of American movie actors for your leads, mix them up with a bunch of English character actors, boil and serve. At least the serving is attractive, and they're not your average Hollywood hunks. And if you sort of squint, you can imagine you're watching the outtakes from Barry Lyndon. Now on MovieDrome, a very fine variation on the same theme as Escape from Alcatraz. Robert Bresson's A Man Escaped. Made in 1956, it's based on the true story of André de Vigny, a French officer who was imprisoned by the Germans and the Vichy collaboration government at Montluc jail in 1943. Bresson was a former painter and scriptwriter who was himself a prisoner of war from June 1940 to April 41. Perhaps for that reason, A Man Escaped is quite unlike Escape from Alcatraz or any other film in this familiar genre. The story exists entirely in small details. The minute mechanisms of the hero's escape plan, the matter-of-fact approach to violence, which is quite terrifying, although entirely unseen, the natural use of sound, and the absolutely real performances. No actors were used in this film. That's part of Bresson's unique style as well. He thinks that actors are incapable of projecting the truth. All they can do is act, and Bresson isn't interested in acting. Instead, he always works with real people. Bresson's most famous film is The Trial of Joan of Arc, made 6 years later in 1962. It too has a spare visual style in which abstract details communicate much of the story. It too employs non-actors in an intensely passionate and revealing way. Given that the French cinema has now degenerated, like our own, to the level of the rock video, it's a great pleasure to present this classic film and great adventure movie, A Man Escaped. Tonight on MovieDrome, a great treat in the form of a long unseen spaghetti western, Django, starring Franco Nero, made in 1966. It was directed by Sergio Corbucci, who you may recall was the director of Big Silence, another missing film premiered on MovieDrome. Big Silence was the first western I ever saw where the bad guys absolutely win. It was so troubling the producers actually had Corbucci shoot a happy ending too, which played in certain territories where the sad one was perceived as being too much. Django isn't quite as doom-laden as The Big Silence, but it comes close. It also benefits from an even madder plot and some extraordinary sets and costumes by Giancarlo Simi, who designed all of Sergio Leone's films. Big Silence took place in the snow, Django is set entirely in a sea of mud. It's basically a rip-off of A Fistful of Dollars, which was, of course, a rip-off of Yojimbo, the classic Kurosawa movie about a paid assassin who brings destruction on a town controlled by two groups of bandits. Rumor hath it that Yojimbo is currently being remade by Abel Ferrara, director of Bad Lieutenant. To my mind, Django is the very best of the Yojimbo imitations. It really goes for it far more than A Fistful of Dollars does. It's more violent, more insane, more exotic, with a much higher body count and far more ingenious cruelty. Check out the scene where the unpalatable curate has his ear cut off and is then made to eat it. Such scenes were favorites of Corbucci, who was forever cutting off scalps, tongues, and hands in his Jacobean spaghetti westerns. He died a couple of years ago, having made approximately 30 comedies, Roman sword and sandal picks, and demented westerns such as Django. Django was a very influential movie. In Italy, it was far more popular than the Clint Eastwood films. It made Franco Nero an international star and spawned at least 25 sequels. The last one, Django's Great Return, also starred Franco Nero and was released in 1990. Django was also remade unofficially last year by the American Robert Rodriguez. He called his version El Mariachi. For a long time, there was a rumor that Django had been banned by the British Board of Film Censors. I'm not entirely sure that this was true, but certainly the film never received a cinema release in Britain. Tonight in MovieDrome, it gets its first public screening on these shores. The reason given for its censorship problems was its violence, but by contemporary standards, say those of the average Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, the film is really pretty mild. The violence is exorbitant, improbable, and highly stylized. You may recall the great Jamaican movie The Harder They Come, in which Jimmy Cliff goes to see Django at the Rialto Cinema. The montage of falling bodies and massacred Ku Klux Klansmen impresses him so much that he imagines he is Django in the shootout at the end. Joe Strummer actually wrote a reggae song called Don't Tango with Django in honor of these two influential films. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only spaghetti western that wasn't made in the widescreen Techniscope format. So what you're seeing tonight is more or less the full frame without the edges cut off. They've also dubbed Franco Nero with a Clint Eastwood type voice, but he's a much more interesting character than Eastwood's Man with No Name, clad in his Union colors, dragging his saddle and his favorite coffin into a Confederate-dominated, utterly decrepit border town. The film was shot at Elios Film Studios outside Rome. It's the same set as they used for Big Silence, minus the fake snow. The cameraman was Enzo Barboni, who went on to direct the Terence Hill, Bud Spencer Trinity films under the pseudonym of E.B. Clutcher. As to where the name Django comes from, it appears to be a sick joke on the part of Corbucci and his screenwriter brother Bruno. Django Reinhardt was a famous jazz guitar player, a member of Le Hot Club de Paris, who achieved legendary status despite lacking several fingers on one hand. How does that tie in with our Django? Well, you'll have to see the film.
Filmmaker Alex Cox introduces tonight's MovieDrome cult classic, Diva.
Tonight's film, Diva, was released in 1981. It's the sort of film that American movie critics like very much, because it's big on style, short on substance, and in French. It's the kind of film that gets called scintillating, or fabulous, frothy fun. It doesn't have any passion, really, nor any acting of note. It doesn't seem to have a theme, nor any direction. Except, of course, for art direction. It has tons of that. It's the only film I've ever seen where a whole sequence, the color of the walls, the set decoration, the costumes, everything is designed to complement a packet of Gitane cigarettes. It's an art director's film, really, and the production designer's name is Hilton McConaughey. Hilton's film is definitely a post-punk movie, sort of reminiscent of all the good things that happened after those nasty, dirty punk rockers went away and style came in fashion once again. It's the filmic equivalent, if you like, of The Mail on Sunday or The Pages of the Face. It features musical selections from the noted opera La Wally, une de mes favorites. When Diva came out, it was pretty popular. It was sort of an instant cult. So who knows? Maybe you'll be a cultist too. Face to Face is one of 3 political westerns by the Italian director Sergio Sollima, who sometimes operates under the pseudonym of Sterling Simon. The other 2 films were The Big Gun Down, an excellent bounty hunter movie starring Lee Van Cleef and Thomas Milian, and Run Man Run, a rather worse than mediocre sequel involving the further adventures of Milian. They were political in much the same way as all the spaghetti westerns, setting up a rural-urban conflict in which the city dwellers are always insidious degenerates or usurious bankers, and the rural characters innocent exploitees, often championed by a glamorous social bandit. It's a straightforward, simple-minded view that you can find even in supposedly sophisticated Italian films, the most lumbering example perhaps being 1900. Face to Face, which was made in 1967, has been described as a parable of the rise of European fascism. Well, maybe. It certainly has the political schematic outlined above, but to me it seems more a Borgesian tale of fate and doppelgangers. You can take your pick. It also has, and this is where it gets good, some of the most improbable character names and some of the most outlandish haircuts ever seen in a Western. Gian Maria Volonte plays Professor Brad Fletcher, a consumptive Boston University teacher who heads west for his health. Volonte is, of course, one of the great spaghetti Western actors. He was the bandit chief in Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, and he was the unwilling revolutionary in A Bullet for the General. Volonte was a serious actor who'd been blacklisted for being a communist. Leone was the first director to break ranks and give him a job. Later, he went on to appear in more serious political films, including Sacco and Vanzetti and Francesco Rossi's Lucky Luciano. He's always good, and this is one of his better Western roles. In Face to Face, Brad Fletcher becomes involved with a Mexican bandit with the unlikely moniker of Solomon Beauregard Bennett, leader of a hippie-esque outlaw gang called Bennett's Raiders. Beauregard is played by Thomas Milian, the Cuban actor who appeared in Solima's other political westerns and in many other spaghettis, including the truly extraordinary Django Kill. Milian, like Volonte, is a proper actor. He played the priest in Dennis Hopper's Peruvian epic, The Last Movie, and recently was seen as one of the anti-Castro hitmen in Oliver Stone's JFK. The chemistry between Volonte and Milian is really interesting, and it keeps the film alive when it might otherwise expire, as for instance in the incongruous hippie commune scenes. There are also those haircuts to contend with. But Face to Face is really quite an entertaining and intriguing film. Watch out for several spaghetti western regulars, including William Berger as the mysterious Charlie Siringo, Aldo Sambrel as the treacherous polecat Zachary Schott, and Angel del Pozo in the role of the gentleman gunfighter Maximilian Dowington. For the discerning enthusiast, we proffer the new MovieDrome Guide. You can find out how to order your copy at the end of tonight's film.
Now on BBC Two, the second of tonight's MovieDrome films stars Jack Palance and Brigitte Bardot in Jean-Luc Godard's Le Mépris, introduced by Alex Cox.
Le Mépris, alias Contempt, is Jean-Luc Godard's version of The Odyssey, or to be more precise, his version of an American film producer trying to make a film version of The Odyssey with a French screenwriter at Cinecittà Studios outside Rome. at a time when American studios had begun to come to Italy and Spain to make big costume epics, films like Cleopatra and Lawrence of Arabia. They don't do that anymore, of course, nor do they invest in big-budget British films like The Devils and Oh Lucky Man, the way they did in the early 70s. Instead, a cultural iron curtain has descended between Europe and the United States, courtesy of a little thing called GATT. GATT, as you're no doubt aware, is the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. It's a so-called free trade agreement, which is supposed to create a level international playing field for manufacturers, producers and salespeople the world over. One of the provisions of said GATT is that the state can't subsidize national industry. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to the military, and the Pentagon is still free to hand out billions of dollars in development subsidies to Boeing, McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed. But one area GATT was supposed to apply to was the media. And so, towards the end of last year, a fierce battle erupted between the Americans, who wanted to end all European government film subsidies, and the French, who didn't. Never mind that the Americans already control 80% of the world's film market, they wanted the lot of it. I never thought I'd be grateful to the French for anything, but I was here, and so were a lot of other people involved in the business of making films. Tonight, a dark, ironic movie on the wretchedness that is world cinema. Jack Palance said cinematographer Raoul Coutard that Godard is trying to explain something to his wife in Le Mépris. It's a sort of letter, one that's costing the producer Beauregard $1 million. Godard is the master exponent of male-female misery, and the miserable scenes between Piccoli and his increasingly alienated wife are excellent. Philip Strick, in the Monthly Film Bulletin, did an elaborate analysis of similarities between Contempt and The Odyssey itself, and also discussed the film's very strategic use of color, blues versus reds, with yellow as the neutral shade. It's a stark but extraordinarily beautiful film. Raoul Coutard's other credits include Alphaville, Breathless, and Jules et Jim. Don't miss the traditionally happy Godardian ending. Next, as part of the tastefully titled Keep Death on the Road, a double bill, a strong message film in favor of seatbelts and cordless telephones, Detour. Detour is an early film noir made in 1945. The director was Edgar G. Ulmer, who was born in Austria in 1900. Originally a production designer who worked in both film and theater for such names as Max Reinhardt and Alexander Korda, Ulmer came to the United States in 1931. He began his career as a director in 1934 on a studio picture, The Black Cat. Thereafter, he made low-budget films for the greater freedom it gave him. Freedom to create such immortal works as The Man from Planet X, Babes in Baghdad, and The Amazing Transparent Man. Detour is the tale of a classically weak film noir hero, Al Roberts, who resides in a small town with his girlfriend Sue. Sue aspires to go to Hollywood and be an actress, even though Al warns her millions of people go out there every year and end up polishing cuspidors. Sue goes anyway and becomes a waitress. Al follows. The misfortune which overtakes Al on the road is so unlikely that I shall not tell it to you here. You have to see it for yourself, how in attempting to put the top up on a convertible, Al Roberts is transformed from neighborhood nice guy into a maniac, wanted for 2 murders and countless felonies. And what murders! One of them is totally insipid. The other is outstandingly bizarre. And neither is Al's fault. Well, not entirely his fault. You'll see. Al, played by Tom Neal, resembles the central character of You Only Live Once, or Hitchcock's The Wrong Man. An innocent, caught in the vengeful grip of fate and the justice machine. In Detour, the hero's predicament is enhanced by the presence of a spectacularly bad girl in the form of Vera, the dominatrix blackmailer, played by Anne Savage.
How far'd you say we're going?
Los Angeles?
L.A.? L.A.'s good enough for me, mister.
Detour has some rather hokey montages and dream sequences, but it benefits from a good script, constantly obsessed with money. What's $10, asks the hero. A piece of paper crawling with germs. There's certainly too much voiceover narration, and the film ends oddly early, lasting just over an hour. But the hero's in a great mess, and the villainess is marvelous. And there's even a putative role reversal, good man becoming bad, if not vice versa. Note how most of the noir thrillers we're showing this year, Detour, Build My Gallows High, Act of Violence, and The Narrow Margin, all contain sequences of relentless road travel, such as must have been the norm for many Americans drifting west after the Second World War. Detour and Act of Violence feature more or less the same shot, the vehicle carrying the protagonist traveling from right to left through Joshua Tree Park in Southern California. The Joshua Tree often acts as a cut-price saguaro cactus for movies wishing to indicate that we have reached the American Southwest, the Joshua Trees being only 3 hours' drive from production HQ in Los Angeles. That day in Arizona, intones Al Roberts as he sees the Joshua Trees. He obviously failed to bring along his gazetteer of desert plants. Good evening, and welcome to the new season of MovieDrome. Among the diverse delights we have for you this year are such cult gems as Kiss Me Deadly, The Harder They Come, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, excursions into horror with Halloween,
Killed him. You can't kill the boogeyman.
and The People Under the Stairs. We have a generous helping of film noir, and a pair of demented biker movies. To begin the celebrations, a science fiction double bill, starting with The Andromeda Strain, a thriller based on a novel by Michael Crichton, the first such thriller, I think. It was made in 1970 in CinemaScope. This was the era of great experimentation in American film styles, and Andromeda Strain reflects this overtly in its use of split-screen sequences, as per The Boston Strangler and The Thomas Crown Affair. Tonight you'll see Andromeda Strain in its original CinemaScope form.
I was afraid of that. The birds will eat the infected flesh and then fly off and spread the disease.
If it is a disease.
The three Michael Crichton films that I'm familiar with are Westworld, Jurassic Park, and this one. And they all seem to have the same basic theme. In each film, man creates a high-tech electronic and mechanical paradise which invariably goes haywire and turns on its customers and creators. The Frankenstein story applied to theme parks and government installations. In the Andromeda Strain, an American satellite returns to Earth with a deadly organism from outer space, a life form which kills almost all humans on contact. While the scientists urge nuclear destruction of the affected area, and politicians weigh up the likely consequences of incinerating select portions of the USA, a team of ace biologists and surgeons struggle to isolate the alien bacteria and find a cure.
Whatever killed them at Piedmont is still there and still as potent as ever.
If potent's the word. Let's try a rhesus. So, okay. Isolate and identify.
Right.
What's really interesting about this movie is its matter-of-factness. There are no movie stars, no love interest, no action until almost the very end. There's no music for the first hour of the film. The dialogue is often mundane and trivial, like the dialogue in that science fiction masterpiece, 2001, which is just as it should be, since the events in question, encounters with alien life, the possible annihilation of the human species, are so momentous. Ratcheted up just a notch, these could be Kubrick scientists with their animal experiments, their top-secret government assignments, and their obsessive cleanliness.
We face quite a problem. How to disinfect the human body, one of the dirtiest things in the known universe.
That is about killing the human being at the same time.
It gets tougher as we go, I'm afraid.
Hard on the taxpayers, isn't it, the way we burn up uniforms?
They're paper.
Perhaps not surprisingly, special photographic effects are by Douglas Trumbull, who did the special effects on 2001 and later directed his own science fiction film, Silent Running. For my money, this is the best of these Crichton science fiction thrillers. There's a nice layer of irony, not quite of Kubrickian proportions, but much more than would be acceptable in a mainstream Hollywood film today. The Andromeda Strain was more than competently directed by Robert Wise, who is very good with individual scenes, but lets the movie as a whole run on too long. Wise was the editor of Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, and the director of many studio epics, including Sound of Music and Star Trek, and weirder small-scale films like Curse of the Cat People and Day the Earth Stood Still. The Andromeda Strain is unique in one particular way. It manages to pull off a third act of running, jumping, hiding, chasing, shooting laser gun scenes which are actually interesting. Now, this is very rare. Normally, modern science fiction films follow the pattern of They Live, which after a tremendous opening degenerates into endless shots of people running and chasing down corridors, firing off laser guns, like an old episode of Doctor Who without the Daleks. The Andromeda Strain actually manages to have such a finale and to make it exciting, as one of the scientists crawls around a nuclear bomb while being blasted by robot-directed laser beams and sprayed with poison gas. It's a splendid finale. How, by the way, do you know in a movie whether the plane is going to explode or not? The answer is contained tonight in the form of product placement. Product placement is a form of baksheesh whereby the film's producers or the studio agree to have the actors use a certain brand of deodorant or drink a certain type of canned beverage or fly a certain carrier's planes. In return for the free advertising, the film receives free beer or plane tickets, or a certain brand of sweetener is added to somebody's Swiss bank account. Hence, if tonight the hero is traveling aboard a certain actual existing airline, relax. No airline is going to lend its logo to a movie if the plane then gets blown up, any more than a whiskey company is going to give free bottles to a production in which the hero dies of drink. So, from now on, if you see Warren Beatty getting aboard a plane bearing an obviously fake airline logo such as American Transair, be on your guard. At very least, there's going to be a mid-air collision and Warren is going to have to wrestle the old Airbus in for an emergency landing on the M6.
The devil's list of all the witches in England. Just as Tail Gunner Joe's list of 160,000 communists or heterosexuals or whatever it was shaped the domestic policy of his nation, so Matthew Hopkins made a thriving living chasing down witches and, to a lesser extent, warlocks in East Anglia 300 years ago. Hopkins was paid £23 for a day's work at a time when the average wage was 6p a day. He was an industrious witch finder and hanged 68 women in Suffolk and 100 in Bury St Edmunds. In the fiscal year of 1665 to 66, Matthew Hopkins made over £1,000. Tonight's film, the story of Matthew Hopkins, featuring an old MovieDrome favorite, Vincent Price, was the object of considerable outcry over its gratuitous violence. When it first came out, it was embroiled in a controversy similar to that surrounding Michael Powell's infamous Peeping Tom. Today, inevitably, in the wake of the Freddy saga, Friday the 13th, and Michael Douglas, it seems relatively tame. Vincent Price is, as you might imagine, the best thing in it. Untroubled by his accent, he cuts a swath through England during the Civil War, behaving for all the world like a misogynist serial killer and would-be parliamentary appointee. Witchfinder General was made by Tygon British Pictures. Tygon were at the time the principal rival of Hammer horror films, and so you can expect to find the same impenetrable day-for-night shots, the same endless tortured yells, the same attention to period detail and heaving breasts as you would in a carry-on film. Something else Witchfinder General has in common with the British comic cinema is the presence of Wilfrid Bramble, alias Old Man Steptoe, in the role of Master Coach. Also look out for a cameo by Patrick Wymark as Oliver Cromwell. The film was shot like TV by one Johnny Coquillian, who went on to become John Coquillian, cinematographer of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Straw Dogs, Cross of Iron, and The Osterman Weekend. All in all, this is a fairly routine price horror movie with none of the excessive genius of the Roger Corman Edgar Allan Poe films, the American title of which, find a general, was The Conqueror Worm, a line from a poem by Poe, presumably chosen to cash in on the success of the Corman films. Nevertheless, it has a certain cultish fame, and is a pretty pervasive warning against over-associating with black cats or stoats. Witchfinder General, directed in 1968 by Michael Reeves, who at the time was one of the great hopes of British cinema. He died shortly after finishing this film.